She was raised by a ghost of special warfare, a man whose greatest lessons were never written down, only passed on through discipline, precision, and judgment. Years after his death, his daughter walks into a combat zone carrying his final letter over her heart. When the night breaks open, everything he taught her rises at once. This hook is about inheritance, identity, and how the people we lose can still shape the lives we save.
A burst of static, then her voice cut through the bedlam, strangely steady for a valley engulfed in flames. As tracers stitched the sky, she spoke to 480 men with an unnatural calm. Alpha, push west, 150 mics, she commanded. Lock down that ravine. Execute. Pinned by enemy fire, Commander Nate Harwick felt the battle tilt in a way his 30 years of service couldn't process. 480 of the military's finest were boxed in a kill zone. The brass had called it a milk run, a standard op in mountains they had walked for 2 decades. That intel was complete crap. The eastern attack was surgical. Then the west opened up. The valley floor became a boneyard in less than 2 minutes. Red lines tore through the blackness. To his left, a Marine screamed. To his right, 2 men went quiet with a final, heavy stillness. He keyed the handset. "Doc, what's your location?" 5 seconds of radio silence felt like an entire lifetime. "Pinned, sir. Eyes on north. Mortars are walking east. Move, you're wounded." She cut in before he could respond, her tone leaving no room for debate. "Move your men, Commander. I am securing this flank." Harwick just stared at his radio. No one had ever hijacked his command channel. It wasn't the absence of fear, but her control of it, a strength he had rarely witnessed. He followed the command. The survivors would later struggle to articulate what happened that night. Every account was the same. No one on the net had ever sounded like her. She was their bedrock. She held the radio tight, her shoulder leaking blood from a gunshot. Her fatigues were soaked dark as a bitter cold began to bite. But her concentration was a blade, her grip was firm, and her voice did not crack. 477 men greeted the dawn because of her actions. But that's the end of the story. It begins 18 hours prior, with a chopper crew flying blind into a death trap. They were inbound with zero visibility on the situation. The forward operating base was a speck at 6,000 feet. Just 3 Connex boxes and a sat dish inside a coil of razor wire. For the Marines stationed there, perimeter security was just another routine. Steep canyon walls hemmed them in. The thin, punishing air was a condition they'd long since accepted. You accept what you can't alter. The cold was a given. At 1700 hours, the last helicopter touched down, its blades kicking up a blinding curtain of dust. A crew chief kicked out some cases as a single figure disembarked. The helicopter was already ascending before her boots made contact with the dirt. The rotor wash slammed into her, but she walked into it. She had the camp's layout memorized, burned into her mind from a classified briefing. That same document contained something else, a secret she held close to the vest. That hidden objective was her actual reason for being there. The rucksack she carried and the case in her hand were just standard-issue government equipment. Dressed in gray BDU pants, she crossed the landing zone with a measured calm. Petty Officer First Class Colt Briggs observed her, a data pad in his hand. He was a mountain of a man, 6'2" of solid muscle. He appraised her with the same critical eye he used for new gear. He elbowed the man beside him. "Bet her ruck weighs more than she does." The other Marine kept quiet. She was slight, maybe 5'4" and 120 pounds soaking wet. The Marine at the gate had already given her ID a second look. Her gaze never settled, not merely seeing, but analyzing her surroundings. If Briggs had been truly observant, he might have noticed, but he had already written her off. The manifest listed her as Tessa Cole, a civilian doctor. NavSpec Warcom had requested her as a last-second replacement. Her file was perfect. Johns Hopkins, a specialist in combat trauma. 2 tours downrange, 53 confirmed saves, and 0 KIAs. That last data point had snagged Commander Harwick's attention. A 53-0 record in a combat zone was more than just good fortune. 40 minutes later, he found her in the aid station. She was already organizing supplies according to the op plan, her movements efficient and sure. She glanced up. "Commander, you've seen the plan." "I have." Your thoughts? She tilted her head. The casualty projection is low. I'd increase it by 20%. He was speechless. It's going to tax your logistics, she noted. This tent will be swamped. I require 3 alternate casualty collection points. Harwick had been prepared for the usual contractor gripes. He was not prepared for a civilian to critique his operational math. Make it so, he ordered. As he stepped back into the cold, he mentally tagged her, a wild card. Briggs aired his doubts 3 times before evening chow. At the gear inspection, he griped that her medical pack was too cumbersome. During the briefing, she stayed locked on the terrain map. The 3rd instance was in the mess tent. He informed his squad that she was a liability, stating it as an indisputable fact. In his sphere, that was the final word. Liabilities were the reason good Marines came home under a flag. They were the element you removed before an operation went sideways. In his view, he was just being prudent. He was oblivious to the fact she heard him through the thin canvas wall. She simply continued to eat. Her father had taught her to hold her tongue until the time was right. She had followed that principle for 16 years. At twilight, Chief Vance Dunar approached her by the perimeter wire. At 53, he possessed a deep-set calm the younger men hadn't earned yet. It was the quiet of a man who had witnessed enough to be unshakable. He had been watching her, his look more inquisitive than critical. She was watching the darkness claim the valley. He stood beside her, silent for a long moment. Frank Cole was your father. She held her breath for a second. He was, she answered. Team 3, Desert Storm, Somalia. 3 rotations in the sandbox, retired in 2012. She finally looked at him. I was in Coronado with him in 95, Dunar said. 24 in bulletproof. Your dad fixed that. Frank disassembled my ego in under an hour, without ever raising his voice. He didn't mention me, she said, her voice unreadable. He wasn't big on names. That was Frank, Dunar agreed. But he mentioned his kid once. Said, you had the eye. He called it the most natural instinct he'd seen in 40 years, and he was teaching you to trust it. She didn't respond. He passed in 2019. March 14th, a brain hemorrhage. 57. He survived all those deployments, to die in a hospital bed. She reported the details with a clinician's precision, the memory's sting blunted by the passage of time. Dunar just nodded. Sorry for your loss. Thank you. Night fell on the valley like a door slamming shut. The base generator sputtered to life. I saw you with the map earlier, Dunar remarked. You zeroed in on the high ground, the key terrain. That was all Frank. Her silence was her only response. Listen, I'm not trying to shake you down, he went on. It's just an observation. I get it now. Whatever your real purpose is here, you're among friends. The command element had to be read into the program. Now I am. He turned and departed. She remained by the wire. To really get it, you have to know about Frank Cole. His name is not in the history books. His service record is a ghost. He ducked cameras his entire career. Inside the teams, however, his story was currency passed between operators. He joined up at 18. At Bud S, he had a peculiar stillness that unnerved the cadre. He wasn't the biggest man, nor the fastest. But when the world ended, he could retreat to a place inside himself that Hell Week was meant to destroy. Very few men could do that. He earned his trident, honed his skills, and constantly adapted. He saw beyond the op to the wider conflict. He was at Desert Storm, in Somalia, and at the Battle of Mogadishu. That firefight in October served as a harsh reminder of how badly an operation could fail. After 9/11, he completed 3 tours in Afghanistan. His missions were classified so deep they effectively never happened. His old team called him Ghost, a name he'd earned. He EAS'd in 2012, setting up near Pendleton. Life fell into a new cadence. Morning PT, weapons care, and coaching at a private range. For her 10th birthday, he gave her a rifle, not to mold her in his image. At 10, she learned its mass, a reality known to the children of warriors. It was a tool for a sterner lesson, the cold physics of ballistics and the core of the complet. He made her understand the weight of that choice, a brutal lesson in cause and effect. They drilled on weekends. In the quiet of dawn, she learned to gauge distance, read the air, control her breathing, and break a clean shot. Ballistics became instinct, patience her virtue. She saw the chasm between a potential hit and a necessary one. At 16, she struck a target 900 meters out in a crosswind. His only feedback, sloppy follow-through. She tightened up. It was the most profound compliment he could offer. Her admission to Johns Hopkins earned his total endorsement. He believed her hands were made to heal, even after he had taught them how to harm. He acknowledged the paradox she embodied. In March of 2018, he wrote a last letter for her to find when he was gone. His heart was failing. The medical assessments were final. He approached his end with tactical precision, putting his final intelligence on paper. He died March 14, 2019, in a VA hospital, 57. She was a 21-year-old sophomore when the 0600 call fractured her world. The very structure of her life disintegrated. In that emptiness, she began anew. She attended her classes, one mission at a time, the way he had trained her. 2 weeks later, she discovered the letter with his personal belongings. She read it just once in her Denton dorm in the weak winter light and then secured it. It was a constant part of her loadout. The memory surfaced as she moved to the aid station to prepare her equipment. She had already cached trauma supplies in 3 different spots. An off-the-record prep conducted alone in the dark, unseen. 4 hours before hour, she found Lance Corporal Reed Kowalski. At 23, he was a boot, strung tight before seeing combat. His rifle was immaculate, its action buttery smooth. He looked like a recruiting poster, a flawless weapon awaiting activation. For 90 seconds she observed, seeing the slow, inorganic blink rate everyone else overlooked. Observation was her skill. His hands were steady, but the cadence was wrong. A tiny delay that signaled an issue. A Marine yelled. Kowalski's head pivoted a fraction of a second too late. Auditory processing lag. She moved closer. Kowalski. He looked up, his face blank. Doc. Don't move, she commanded, taking his pulse, examining his pupils. She asked 3 questions, measuring the delay, not the response. You have heat stroke, she stated. It began yesterday. Elevated core temperature, weak pulse. You are grounded for 3 hours, fluids and rack time. He started to protest. Doc, I'm good. Your cognitive speed is degraded by 12%, she interrupted, her voice toneless. Not enough for you to perceive. In combat, that delay gets you or your squad mate killed. You're a risk. I can push this up the chain. He considered his few options, then met her eyes. Roger that. I'm down. The IV was in his arm in less than 20 seconds. Harwick, the CO, observed from afar. With the saline running, she reported, he'll be fit for duty in 3. Light duty till 1400. Harwick offered a single nod and departed. Sergeant Briggs was silent but stepped in closer, his gaze fixed on her, his judgment of her visibly shifting. The mission brief started at 1300. The tent was overflowing. Harwick gave the brief with stark efficiency. No word was extraneous. Tessa remained in the back, a shadow, her focus absolute. The map showed the AO. The target was a weapons cache in a hostile compound, 8 clicks distant. The primary approach was through the valley, with an alternate along the north ridge. Staff Sergeant Alresh was on overwatch. She was the sole medic on the manifest. 40 minutes in, the conversation turned to sniper heights. Harwick identified 2 positions. Grid 477 puts the team in the backblast, she commented, her eyes on her notes. The ledge at grid 479, 30 meters north, is clear and provides a superior line of fire. The tent became still. Harwick's gaze shifted from the map to his corpsman. Confirm. Topo map, she answered. He checked it for 5 seconds. He adjusted the plan to her coordinates. Briggs was 2 meters away. She sensed his stare without looking, the quiet reevaluation of a man observing sheer competence. She made one last notation and went silent. The hours before a mission carry their own specific gravity. On the FOB, all movement became purposeful. The ambient sound diminished as each Marine began his preparations. They disassembled their rifles with a focus only combat can breed. She ran a mental checklist of her aid bag, then stopped. Her hand moved to her chest, feeling the sharp outline of the letter through her blouse. It had been there, over her heart, for 5 years. Her father understood a fundamental truth. The most decisive moments in life do not announce their arrival. They simply occur, so the vital words must be spoken early. He had given her every tool she would require. The text was now part of her, less a memory than the very structure of her mind. It was as fundamental as bone. Her hand remained flat over her chest. Outside, as the sun went down, the air took on a sharp quality. At 2100 hours, the helicopters lifted, following the contours of the land. Tessa was in the second aircraft, watching the dark terrain blur past the door. Her mind was a fixed point, a stillness he had taught her to construct. The objective was 3 clicks beyond the valley. Intelligence indicated low risk. The drone feed was empty, a cakewalk. She understood the void between the brief and the reality. The actual threat is never the one you prepare for. She kept her doubts to herself. Her function was not to question the mission, but to anticipate its failure points. They landed 2 clicks out. The helos disappeared, leaving only rotor wash and a heavy, waiting silence. She took her position in the center of the formation. Her walk was efficient, conserving power for the engagement. Vance Dunar was 3 men up on her left. A click in, he looked back, his eyes connecting with hers with perfect, honed precision. Their eyes held for a moment before he faced forward again. She resumed reading the ridge lines, analyzing the terrain as if it were a document. At 3.5 clicks, she saw it. A subtle heat shimmer over the rocks on the east ridge. At her 2 o'clock, a minor warp in the air, nearly invisible. 100 meters on, she saw it again, a signal in the noise. Not a target, but a data point. She recorded the information dispassionately. 3 clicks from the objective, the night came apart. The first rocket screamed from the east ridge, the concussion, a brutal impact to her chest. The shockwave strikes your skeleton an instant before the sound. Before the blast died, both ridges erupted with muzzle flashes, a flawless L-shaped ambush. They'd been compromised. The enemy had their route, their schedule, everything, none of which was relevant for the next minute and a half. Survival became the only mission. The squad dove for cover on reflex. Tessa was already gone. She sprinted to a rock outcropping she had already noted, 12 meters away. She reached it in 6 seconds, kit open. The first wounded Marine got to her 5 seconds later. Arm wound, shrapnel. Packed and bandaged in under 2 minutes, Kowalski was going into shock. A 4-second look told her why. Femoral artery, no pressure. The tourniquet was applied, high and tight. She packed the wound with combat gauze, exerting savage, essential force. She spoke while she worked, her tone level, feeding him data, not comfort. A man on the brink needs intel. Tourniquet is on. It's going to hurt. That is how you know it's working. Eyes on me, he obeyed. Good man. The third Marine was dragged to her. Deviated trachea, no breath sounds on one side, tension pneumothorax. He was drowning in his own chest. She found the 14-gauge needle, located the second intercostal space, and drove it in. The hiss of escaping air was the sound of a life being given back. She was already moving. 2 machine guns had them pinned. The nests were dug into a ledge, protected from direct fire, a tactical catastrophe. As she treated a 4th man, Harrelson was on the radio. "Give me a fix on those guns now!" Albright was down, his rifle 20 meters away. Her mind divided its focus between medicine and tactics, tracking the enemy emplacements. After she stabilized the 4th Marine, her eyes met Dunar's. He was 17 meters away, his expression confirming he saw the same lethal problem and was awaiting her solution. Her trauma pack hit the ground. She seized the rifle. The heavy machine gun on the ridge hammered their position. Each burst a countdown clock for the 40 Marines trapped in the ditch. From an inside pocket, she produced a letter, its paper worn thin from 5 years of handling. She held her breath for 3 beats. The words inside validated a truth her soul had long accepted. and her mind finally grasped. She put the letter away, her eyes finding Dunar's. M24, she said. Location? He answered instantly. Albright's truck, driver's side. She was already gone. The rifle was there. 16 years of training took control as her hand closed on cold steel. It wasn't a choice. It was instinct, honed by 1,000 reps until it was reflex, like flipping a switch in a familiar room. A round slid into the chamber. The safety clicked. Her hand found the Schmidt and Bender 3x12 scope. The scope wasn't ideal, but it would work. She was already running the ballistics. Dunar moved left without a word, a silent, practiced dance. He took a position 12 meters away, covering the north and reading the wind. She was climbing before she knew it. The slope was a steep 35 degrees of loose rock, with only darkness for cover. She moved with an animal grace, every step deliberate. The hail of incoming fire to her right was just another obstacle, not a threat to evade. Sparks flew as 3 rounds struck stone 15 meters off. She adjusted her path 4 meters and continued her ascent. Dunar's voice came through. Wind ENE, 12 knots. Temp 41. 60 meters to the peak. Data processed. Target at 780 meters. Her route offered a high angle the grunts below lacked. The enemy's rock cover was now useless. She'd seen this tactical flaw during the briefing. A stone ledge provided a stable platform. She went prone. The rock's cold seeped into her, a detail she noted and dismissed. The bipod deployed with a snap. The rifle became an extension of her body. Through the optic, the nest was sharp. 2 tangos, a gunner and his spotter. They were pros. Dug in tight, they controlled a 780-meter kill box. She began her breathing cycle. Her thoughts drifted to a Texas sunrise. She was 10. Her father taught her shooting was a science, not strength. A mix of physics and anatomy, and the discipline to make your body a perfect instrument for a single moment. 5 years makes you good, he told her. 20 makes you an artist. The difference between chance and certainty. He started her young. The wind held steady at 12 miles per hour, ENE. That 12-mile-per-hour crosswind would cause a 14-inch drift. She compensated. She accounted for drop, air density, even the planet's rotation, a critical factor at this range. She controlled her breath, in for 4, hold, out for 8. The rhythm brought her pulse down from its combat high to the low 60s. The optimal zone, it was second nature. She acquired her sight picture, shifting 2 inches right to solidify her stance. A weak platform ruins a shot. The reticle steadied. She could feel her pulse in her chest, her wrist, her neck. She found the quiet space between heartbeats, that fraction of total calm. That was the window. She squeezed the trigger. The familiar recoil pressed into her shoulder. She managed it and reacquired the target. A miss, 8 inches to the right. The hostile was already dropping, reacting to the supersonic crack. Briggs's voice crackled over the radio from the valley floor, laced with disbelief and accusation. The miss was all that counted. She reran the calculation. An unseen gust had pushed the round. She observed the heat shimmer rising from the rocks, learning its cadence. A calm period occurred every 8 seconds. 4 clicks left on the windage knob. She reset her breathing, lowered her heart rate, and waited for the opportunity. She waited for the 2-second opening. Reticle was on. Trigger squeezed. The heavy machine gun went silent. Dunar's even voice reported, "Target neutralized. Gun is down." She was already moving to a new spot. The next threat was 140 meters south at a new elevation, a fresh problem. She slid 30 meters down a rock slide for a clear line of sight. Moving too quickly on a dark slope is a fatal error. She set up, figuring a 920-meter shot through 2 heat mirages, reading the wind off the grass. 1 press of the trigger. Threat eliminated. 37 minutes, 6 positions, and the pass was open. She dismantled their defense with surgical precision, heavy weapons, their operators, then the 2 light machine guns covering the escape route. She moved like a ghost, executing the plan she'd laid out from the beginning. She only took shots she knew she could make. After that first miss, every bullet found its mark. Each silenced weapon changed the battle below. Pinned down squads began to advance. Harwick was on the net, directing teams through the firing lanes she'd created. There was no thinking anymore. The strategy was finalized at the FOB. A decision had been made. This was just the follow-through. The task required no further debate. It only required what her father had instilled in her: absolute focus and the will to hold on when others would crumble. She never crumbled. After the last gun fell silent, she scanned the ridge for 90 seconds, watching the darkness. Certain, she keyed the radio. "Commander Harwick, ridge lines are secure. Lanes are open. Suggest exfil via the primary route." A beat of silence. Then Harwick's voice, tight with shock, answered. "Roger that, Doc. What's your location?" "North slope, 80 meters up. Coming down now." A longer silence. "Come down easy," he said. Dunar was waiting at the base. Harwick and a silent knot of Marines were 10 feet back. She ignored their stares. She went to her pack, stowed the rifle, took out her med kit, and knelt beside the first casualty. "Who else is hit?" A strange quiet descended, the kind that follows an impossible event. It wasn't confusion. Every Marine there understood what they had witnessed. They saw enemy strongpoints extinguished, one by one. They saw her descend, secure her weapon, and start treating the wounded as if it were routine. 37 minutes of legendary shooting. The silence in the air was heavy. For 4 minutes, Briggs stood frozen. Then he walked over, as she tended to Staff Sergeant Dow, a calf wound from a ricochet, and simply watched her hands. He wore the expression of a man forced to rethink his entire worldview. At last, he asked, "Where in the hell did you learn to shoot like that?" She didn't look up from her patient. "My father." "Who is your father?" She gave him a brief look. "Navy?" Briggs glanced at Dunar, who looked like a man holding a royal flush. Harwick approached, his officer's composure a thin veil over deep shock. It was a brittle calm. His eyes were fixed on her, his mind obviously rewriting every tactical doctrine he had ever learned. "Cole," he began. "Sir, when you are finished." 3 minutes, sir." He waited. She secured the bandage, stood, and met his gaze. The woman he looked at was not the one he thought he knew. "Your father," Harwick said, not as a question. "Frank Cole, Master Chief, retired, SEAL Team 3, Desert Storm, Somalia, 3 tours in Afghanistan." He looked at Dunar. "That's the one," Dunar confirmed, and the name echoed in the silence like a judgment. Briggs was already heading for the SATCOM, about to request a service file that would occupy his entire night. The valley was silent, but not calm. It was the charged quiet after a lightning strike. She looked Harwick straight in the eye. "I have 4 more casualties to assess before we can move, sir." "Then see to it," he said. An hour before sunrise, with the wounded stabilized, Harwick found her on the perimeter. She was leaning against a boulder, methodically restocking her aid bag with efficient, automatic motions. He approached her cautiously. She knew this conversation was coming. "Somalia," he said. Her hands paused for an instant. "October 3rd and 4th, 1993. Dad spoke of it twice. Once when I was 14, because I pushed. Again at 20, during a lesson on combat fatigue." She continued her work. "The men who were really there never talk about it." "No," Harwick said, "they don't." He gazed at the dark ridgeline. "He trained you, from age 10, for 6 straight years. Weekends, holidays. Wind, drop, trigger squeeze, the raw mechanics." A clasp on her kit clicked shut. The training never stopped. "By 19, I had the theory. The rest was just practice. Then he died, and I made a promise to my mother." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "She spent 30 years watching him leave through that door. I swore to her I would let that part of him die with him. Not the man himself, just the part that wasn't focused on saving lives. I gave my word. But tonight, the mission was absolute." Her eyes met his. "My father taught me a promise is a wall. You build it to guard something. It is intended to shield what is important. When that wall becomes a prison, you must decide where your loyalty lies." Harwick saw it in her face. "Sounds like he was a rare breed. The best man I ever knew," she said, her voice firm with certainty. He let the silence sit. Chief Dunar called Frank Cole a ghost. That's the highest praise he offers. Dunar is not a man who wastes praise. He said the same thing about you. She offered no response. Harwick stood up. I want a full after-action report at the FOB. This is not about the mission, he said, his voice sharp. This is about you. Your file, your skills, that was a failure of intelligence on my part. I am the commander here. I am supposed to know my Marines. That is the procedure. Dismissed. He started to leave. Sir. He froze. Kowalski needs a surgeon within 6 hours. My bandage is secure, but time is a factor. The medevac is on its way. He gave her a final look. Cole, get some sleep. She went back to her gear. That kind of peace was not in her inventory. She returned to the job. Work was real. His words surfaced. She first read it at 21 in a cold dorm, the world oblivious to the letter's weight. It appeared with his things 2 weeks post-funeral, an envelope with her name. She opened it in her old room, suffocated by the silence. He began with logistics, always the planner. Bank info, lawyer's contact, V. A. Paperwork. His final ops order, a map for the aftermath, a small kindness in the chaos. Then the letter truly began. Tessa, he wrote, I should say this in person, but my time is short. This life has no clean breaks. I learned to speak plainly before the shooting starts. In the shit, there's no time. I respect your promise to your mother. She only asked because of who I am. Your mother has a wisdom we can't understand, bought with 30 years loving a man like me. But I have to say this. I showed you the ropes, not to make you me, but because you had to see the truth. I was always straight with you on that. To know a thing, bone deep, is to control it. Ignorance is a killer. Knowledge is a choice. I've trusted your gut since you were 12. You can read a situation like few others and make the right call. In 40 years, I've seen that maybe 5 times. A day is coming when your oath and the right call will conflict. I can't wargame that for you. I can only say I have faith you'll know the difference. Whichever way you go, you earned my respect long before any choice was made. It was signed, your father. Simple, final. She knew it by heart after 100 readings, but kept the letter. The paper was proof. Its feel, the ink's impression. The truth that his hand formed these words. She'd held it tight at the ridgeline just before taking up the rifle. Now, in the sharp air, dawn was setting last night's actions in stone. She had to answer for that promise. She didn't just bend the promise, she atomized it. In her mother's house, she swore an oath she fully intended to keep. Last night, she torched it. Both things were now true. They had to coexist. Her father saw this coming. He knew the vow and the objective would collide, and she'd see it. She did. 60 operators watched that sunrise. Kowalski, just 23, was going home. The 40 men in the kill box, seconds from being wiped out, got to see another day. She stowed that truth away like any other piece of gear. And she watched the light take the valley. An hour past dawn, Briggs showed up. He skipped the small talk, found a rock, and eyed the high ground. Frank Cole, he finally said. I pulled his file on the sat phone. Desert Storm. 11 confirmed kills. Long range, all clean. Somalia, 3 tours in Afghanistan, 7 awards, 4 of them classified above my head. He went quiet. A man's record is just the public story. I can't imagine the rest. She was silent. I told you something when you got here, he added. I recall. I'd take it back, but it don't work like that. He finally met her eyes, squaring a debt with himself. I made a command call on bad intel. That ain't how I keep my men alive. It's a lesson I shouldn't need again. You made a call on the available facts, she replied. That's the job. I did my job wrong, he shot back. Bad intel, bad result. Silence grew between them. Acknowledge it, she said. Then file it for later use. That's what my father would do. He just watched her. Was he the type to just leave it there? He was the type to say it once, and you damn well better get it. She paused. He'd spend hours picking apart last night's failures, then decide the outcome was acceptable. Coming from him, that was a unit citation. Briggs thought on it, then stood. His whole posture changed. Some weight had been lifted. For the record, What you did up there was textbook. Any textbook I know. He turned and walked away. She watched him leave. The case vac was wheels up at 0900. She kept pressure on 2 wounded, calling vitals with the flat calm used for men hurt worse than they knew. Kowalski was awake for most of it. He just watched her, silent. The smart move. The FOB appeared as they descended. She went from the chopper to the aid station and started the handoff, detailing every field treatment for the medics. Her brief was precise. A sloppy report can kill a man who already beat the odds. She wasn't clear for a solid 2 hours. Harwick was there when she exited the tent. His expression was past shock, hardened into a cold need for answers. They sat on a pair of Pelican cases. "Walk me through it," he said. The unit doc, Lieutenant Marsh, went down with appendicitis 4 days back. The slot was filled by a contractor. I put my name forward. Why? She was ready for that. I read the ops brief. It listed a single sniper element. I checked Staff Sergeant Alrek's file, solid Marine. But this terrain requires a second overwatch, bare minimum. The billet was for a medic. Her gaze was level. I'm qualified as both, so I filled the slot. Harwick studied her. You knew another asset might be needed before you got on that bird. I knew it was a possible outcome, not a definite one. You didn't disclose that skill set. My medic certs are in my file. My trigger time is not. My father's training was unofficial. It's not in the system for assignment. SOCOM has no record. Her stare didn't break. If I'd listed it, things would have played out differently. There are procedures to get another shooter. Those procedures take time. I had 4 days. The system would have sent a body to fill a role, not an asset, who already saw the mission's flaw. He was silent. You embedded knowing our weak point, he said, and you positioned yourself to fix it without a word. Yes. Why the secrecy? She thought for a second. If I showed up as a shooter with a medic patch, we'd be debating credentials that don't officially exist. I'd have wasted this tour defending my resume instead of doing the job. She let that hang in the air. The job was more important than the debate. Harwick got up and paced 4 steps away, then turned back. My after-action report tonight will contain only the facts, he said. All of them. That AAR goes to hire, and I can't predict their reaction. You have to understand that. I do. This could have major blowback for you, sir. 3 dead, 22 wounded, mission fail. This is already a cluster. What you did either gets reported clean or it gets buried. And if it's buried, I'm the only one who looks good, and my career is not the mission. He met her eyes. File the truth, she said. He gave a single, sharp nod and walked toward the command post. She remained on the case, watching the harsh mountains. They seemed clear and defined, like anything after a night that cost too much. She put a hand to her chest. I broke my word, and it was the right move. He must have known. I think I knew too. She stood, needing to file her own reports. The dossier on Owen Graff arrived at 1300 on day 2. Harwick read it twice, then called his team leads. It was a thin file. The real threats always have thin files. Born in Knoxville, Tennessee, 1973, Graff enlisted at 18. He aced the special operations pipeline that washes most guys out. He passed Delta selection. The agency's Special Activities Center recruited him in his early 30s. They handle the dirty work off the books. His assessment placed him in the top 1%. His file named him a tactical genius whose conscience didn't have the usual off switch. He could never just shut it down. The file first listed this as a strength, then later, a weakness. In 2012, he led a 4-man team into Syria on Operation Cardinal. They engaged the target, but their exfil route was compromised. They screamed for help on the radio. Air support was inbound. 40 minutes out, it was called off. The official reason was weather, but 2 outposts reported clear skies. 3 Marines died in the ambush. Graff was taken. For 18 months, he was held in a black site where people disappear. His debrief was almost entirely blacked out. Declared killed in action in December 2012. He was very much alive. For 12 years, he planned his comeback. His plan was now set up in the mountains around them, a strategy built on a decade of cold logic, not fury. His only objective, make the brass answer for bad calls. Harwick shut the file. This isn't about politics, Harwick said. He's not some revolutionary. He has one target: to expose bad command decisions and settle the score. The quiet was heavy. That doesn't make it right. It makes him more dangerous than any true believer. A focused man is always deadlier than a fanatic. A thick silence fell over the command post. He'll hit us again tonight, Harwick said. It was a certainty. A decade of planning doesn't fold after one setback. Tessa stayed back, taking it in. She'd already seen the file over his shoulder. He knew it. A single look was enough. The intelligence landed like a body blow, completely reshaping the tactical map in her head. She saw him in Syria, 2012, learning that relief was en route, right before everything went silent. That razor's edge between rescue and oblivion. She considered what's left of a soldier after 18 months in that pit, how it incinerates faith in the mission, the country, all of it. She contemplated the specific acid of being left for dead by your own, and the way it corrodes a man from the inside out. Shaking the thought loose, she moved back to the battalion aid station. The following 4 hours were dedicated to prep. She restocked her medical kits, repositioned gear, and war-gamed the enemy's most likely avenues of approach. She reviewed the previous night's casualty reports. Field dressings were just a temporary fix. Later, she forced down an entire MRE. Her father's axiom echoed in her head: chow and rack time are ammunition, not luxuries. He had a point. She managed a solid 90 minutes of deep, tactical sleep, the kind only a seasoned operator can summon on demand. She was in the BAS completing a final equipment check when Dunar showed up at 1700 hours. He entered without a sound, their eyes locking. After the last firefight, there was nothing left to be said. Tonight's a new ball game, he stated. I know. Last night you ruled the darkness. Now Graf has you in his crosshairs. His gaze was unwavering. He's gunning for you. She gave a curt nod. You? Solid? She flexed her hand, feeling the familiar pressure point on her trigger finger. Just another piece of intel on her own combat effectiveness. Locked on, she confirmed. His own expression changed, that of a man who'd finally closed a difficult chapter. Your old man sent me an email, he said. January 2019, right before the end. She went rigid. He mentioned a project you were heading, said he was proud. The man hated email. That's how I knew it was vital, something he wanted on the books. Dunar stared past her at the tent canvas. He said you were a consultant on a naval special warfare project, totally off the record, no official credit. He allowed that to land. He detailed a comprehensive system for combat medicine you developed. He called it, quote, the most significant leap forward in soft medicine in 2 decades. Her focus drifted to a nearby med case. He said you kept it anonymous, so the brass couldn't screw with it. Said it was the right move, that it was your signature. The case clicked shut. He knew, she breathed. The moment stretched. Dust motes swam in the fading light. Outside, the wind howled. I had my own reasons for holding on to this, Dunar admitted. I pegged you from the start, but I lacked the bigger picture. I had heard the scuttlebutt that Frank's kid was rewriting the training manuals, but I didn't grasp the scale, that you were mentor. He held her stare. Telling you sooner might have thrown you off your game. Frank was sure you'd see the mission through without needing a medal. I figured I owed you the same respect. She returned his look. He always saw the whole board when the rest of us just saw the next move, she said. Damn straight, you knew the second I got here. I had a strong hunch. You proved it when you tore apart our Overwatch strategy in the briefing. The entire concept had his fingerprints all over it. I was sure of it. He laid the foundation, but the architecture is all you. She remained silent. For 3 years, she had constructed it in the shadows. Squeezing in the work between deployments, it was essential. It was beyond a new set of TTPs. It was a new philosophy, a system she had forged to close the deadly space between command decisions and frontline medical care. Her instruction was delivered over ghost comms, no name, no insignia, completely untraceable. The operators who graduated her program simply called her mentor. The mission is all that matters. Tonight, her voice was steel. Tonight, he affirmed. He left her in the low light of the Tactical Operations Center, so she went to find Harwick. At 2200 hours, Graf's assault erupted. His fighters swarmed from the south, emerging from culverts that intel had completely dismissed. The reconnaissance brief had been largely accurate, except for the one fatal detail. 200 hostiles surged from 4 coordinated points along the southern perimeter. They advanced with the fluid precision of a unit made for the job. This was no repeat performance. This was a revised script from the same director, proving he had learned from his prior failure. The defensive line buckled in the first 4 minutes. Harwick had anticipated a southern attack and had his machine guns laid in to cover it. The initial wave was shredded in the concertina wire. A second wave struck, with a third right behind it. They hit from 3 directions at once, and the line caved faster than any simulation had ever shown. The kind of catastrophic breakdown that happens when the enemy is already inside your OODA loop. The world flashed white as Tessa was working in the BAS. 45 seconds later, she was sprinting toward the eastern flank, moving under a web of green tracers. Her aid bag was, in one hand, her M24 rifle slung across her back. She was both the medic and the marksman. Briggs's 12-man squad was defending the east. She arrived and began triage, going to the most critical first. Petty Officer Holloway, who had a through-and-through GSW in his thigh. As her hands worked, her mind analyzed the firefight. Enemy rounds hammered their position from a sniper-high 200 meters to the southeast, establishing a perfect kill zone. Briggs had 2 men returning fire, but their position was trash. They were only making the shooter duck, not taking him out of the fight. She stuffed Holloway's wound and cranked the tourniquet tight. "Briggs, that ridge at 210, you're masked." His expression confirmed he already knew. 400 meters, 2 hides. The left one's getting cocky, he exposes himself. She was already repositioning for a better shot. "Give me 60 seconds of covering fire." She used a pallet as cover, located the hide in her scope, and dialed her dope for the conditions a more difficult shot from this position. The marksman had a pattern. Expose for 3 counts, cover for 4. She observed him for 3 cycles. On the 4th, she squeezed the trigger. The left side threat dropped. She leopard crawled 40 meters north to get an angle on the second marksman, who was already relocating. Went prone, acquired him, sent it. The hostile overwatch went silent. 30 seconds later, she was at Holloway's side again. Briggs was still reeling from what he had just seen as she checked the tourniquet again. His mind was racing, so he kept his mouth shut. She was already moving to the next man down. At 22:40, Kowalski went down hard. He was supposed to be providing rear security on a perimeter that had become the main front. He'd been holding his section of the line right up until he wasn't. His body just gave out like a seized engine. She'd been monitoring his respirations all day, a habit for her post-surgical patients. His oxygen saturation at 1600 had already been borderline. His breathing was labored, something she'd written off as post-op pain, a mistake. It was a blown diagnosis, the exact kind of error she fought to eliminate from her system. When his breathing pattern faltered at 2240, she knew precisely what was happening. She was at his side in 6 seconds. Tension pneumothorax. The combined stress of the altitude and the firefight had sent him over the brink. No air entry on the left. Tracheal deviation. A complete shutdown of his respiratory system. "Kowalski, look at me." He was unable to speak. His skin had turned a pale, ashen blue, the color of a man drowning from within. She produced a 14-gauge needle, locating the insertion point by touch amid the chaos. Second intercostal space. She drove it in with a single, smooth motion. To hesitate with that needle is to kill him yourself. A sharp hiss of escaping air erupted from his chest. Color rushed back to his face. Her hand was unwavering on his ribs, tracking each breath, her voice a steady anchor. "The needle is set, you are breathing, slow and easy." He complied. Beneath her hand, his stats started to level off, but her focus remained on the larger battle. It was a mental state she inhabited. And then the firefight's cadence broke. The rate of fire from the western sector suddenly tripled. An enemy machine gunner had secured a dominant firing position. Her gaze shot up from Kowalski. 70 meters away, Harwick was trapped in the open near a supply bunker. Repositioning the fire team had been the correct tactical decision, but running the point always comes with a price. The firing lane had been clear 60 seconds ago. Now it was a death trap. A tango on the berm, 240 meters distant, had Harwick zeroed and was walking rounds onto his position. She calculated she had 3 heartbeats. Releasing Kowalski, she snapped at the Marine beside him. Maintain pressure here, he does not move. She didn't sprint toward Harwick, but to a stack of containers 8 meters away that offered a shooting angle. No time to go prone. She dropped to one knee, the rifle already snug in her shoulder. Her pulse pounded in her ears. There was no time for a respiratory pause. She found the crosshairs and squeezed. The 240-meter threat vanished. Harwick's head jerked around, his eyes darting from the neutralized enemy back to her. She was already moving back toward her patient. Her hand was back on his chest, ensuring the seal was intact, picking up exactly where her shot had forced her to leave off. Her father's voice surfaced from a freezing November afternoon when she was 20. At the rifle range, she'd asked him how he could reconcile the man he was with the actions he had to take. He mulled it over for a considerable pause. Finally, you don't. There's no separation. There are only your hands, and they do the work they know. The skill is in knowing which tool to grab for the task, and having the steel to use it. She checked Kowalski's pulse with one hand, while her other continued to scan the defensive line. The understanding struck her, immediate and absolute. She wasn't just a carbon copy of him, she was becoming the operator he always knew she could be. The subtext had been clear all along. Exceed what I did. Owen Graff gave the order to withdraw at 23:14 hours. At the time, High Command never understood the true cause for the withdrawal. The official after-action report would point to tactical missteps, the loss of critical positions, repulsed assaults, and the defenders' overwhelming fire superiority. The brass could spin it how they wanted, but the grunts knew better. The enemy assault didn't just fail, it shattered. They were hit with a pure, primal fear that comes from meeting the unknown. The attackers realized the firebase was a rock. Each wave crashed against a sharp, unforgiving defense. Every planned breach was shut down cold. A different playbook was running the show, one Graff's intel never saw coming. They had a trump card his recon never picked up. The assault team vanished into the night. Harwick had choppers spinning up 4 minutes later. The entire footprint was wiped clean in 17 minutes. She was on the 3rd bird out, a steady hand on 2 wounded, her voice a lifeline. The peaks disappeared into the ink-black night. She zoned in on their vitals. Nothing else mattered. That was the job. They snagged Graff 3 days later. Harwick pulled strings to be there for the processing, fast-tracking the request. Harwick stood before a 51-year-old operator, his face a mask of hard-won resolve from 12 years in hell. Graff was motionless, his features set in granite. He met Harwick's gaze with the silent acceptance of a man whose tab was finally being called. The quiet in the room was thick. Syria. 2012, Harwick stated. Graff's nod was sharp, affirmative. And your unit status post-op? It's in the file. Recite it. For 40 minutes, his sterile report stole every molecule of oxygen from the space. Harwick offered no sympathy. Platitudes were useless here. This notation will be entered into your record, retroactive 12 years. I will handle it myself. Graff's gaze flickered upward, the first fissure in his iron control. This wasn't absolution. It was validation. He looked like a man who'd finally met someone who knew the burden he carried. That will suffice, Graff stated. Harwick's own after-action report was 47 pages, which he delivered to her like standard intel. The report was a brutally honest evaluation of her actions. It documented the 22 casualties she managed over 2 nights, the critical saves, and the strategic thinking driving her decisions. His conclusion was direct, noting her unique access produced outcomes beyond normal channels. 4 days on, inside a Spartan briefing room, he made his pitch. A 2-star wants a word, Thomas Caldwell. He's run a joint training billet at NAVSPEC Warcom for the last 4 years. 3 years back, he approved a Black Ops training module, a pilot program. A ghost of a smile touched Harwick's lips. Gave it the go-ahead, completely blind to the source. He's asking for a sit-down, not commanding one, to discuss codifying it as doctrine. Harwick saw the wheels turning. He also mentioned that knowing it was you, he'd have signed off on it in a heartbeat. She considered the gravity of it all. 4,000 operators. Taking a ghost protocol and making it official TTP, she contrasted the surgical precision of her shadow program with the institutional muscle of official policy. I'll meet him, she decided. Harwick nodded once, his eyes meeting hers. My kid's 22. Going through Bud S. I think about the pipeline he's in. Then I think about the gaps. The hard line we draw between medic and trigger puller. A division we beat into their heads. The statement lingered. Your curriculum is the fix. For him, for all of them. He rose. Glad you were on station. Dunar was the one who broke the news to the guys. The story broke on day 5, just after evening chow. The main bay was jammed with a couple hundred of the 480-man element. The rest choked the passageway, trying to listen in. Scuttlebutt travels at light speed. Tessa was swamped with reports at the aid station. Dunar got in front of the formation and laid it out raw. He talked about Frank Cole, not his file, but the man himself. A legacy forged over 30 years, an instinct for the work, and the protege he'd been grooming in the shadows. He told them about a daughter who built her own legend, not on a name, but on 1,000 0 Dark 30 musters and a lifetime of drive. He mentioned a vow made one night in some forgotten shithole. Then the gunny hit them with the truth about their instructor. No sugarcoating it, just the hard facts they respected. The ghost who'd been teaching them for 3 years, the mind behind their medevac training, was the civvy doc right there in the wire. That steady, clear voice on the comms during the firefight on night 2, the one running the show like she invented it, that was her. And she did it all from cover, with a fresh round in her own shoulder. A dead quiet descended on the bay, the charged stillness before a storm breaks. In the 3rd rank, Corporal Reed Kowalski had listened to that voice 42 times over 3 years of training. He never had a face for the call sign. The protocol was strictly anonymous. As the gunny spoke, he replayed 42 lessons that completely rewired his battlefield instincts. Memories flashed. A dusty ravine, a TQ slapped on in under 90 seconds, a needle D in total darkness, a firm hand on his plate carrier that steadied his breath. He got to his feet. No command given. The jarhead beside him rose. Then another. A wave of silent understanding swept the room. There was no order, just a shared, primal impulse. Down the passageway, Marines who only heard fragments of the news were also standing. Kowalski found her working at the battalion aid station. He'd been walking for 2 days, his lungs still mending. He was gassed, but mobile. He took a seat opposite her as she ground through paperwork, just observing. I know your voice, he rasped. She stopped what she was doing. 3rd cycle, he specified. 2 years back. September. The mass casualty drill. IED. Structural collapse. You said, triage for impact, not velocity. The screamer ain't always the one to treat first. Save the most lives possible. Don't get tunnel vision on a single heroic save. The phrase settled in the air. I've replayed that 400 times. It changed my whole approach. She put down her pen. Affirmative, she replied. He nodded. So what was with the ghost instructor thing? She chose her words carefully. My name on the program would have kicked off a shitstorm about a civilian teaching tactics to operators. She locked eyes with him, and that would have made the conversation about me, not the content. The content is what saves lives. The doctrine had to be solid on its own. He thought that over. 314 classes. 3 years. 14 operators a class, give or take, he muttered. So over 4,000 guys are using your playbook. He stopped. That's how we won. She glanced up. You need to hit the rack, she told him. That lung is still jacked up. I know. He stood. His expression was of a man whose entire world had shifted. Doc, he said from the doorway. She met his look. He gave a solid nod. She returned it. The shoulder surgery took 2 hours. A clean fix, with the surgeon predicting a complete return to duty. She woke from the anesthesia with total clarity, like a system reboot. Harwick was waiting by the bed. He glanced up from his tablet. Op was a success. The doc gave me the blow-by-blow. He set the tablet down. Admiral Caldwell called while you were under. He's been fighting for this joint program for 4 years. He okayed the ghost training on a hunch. Said if he'd known you were behind it, he'd have written a blank check, no questions asked. His objective? To make this entire thing legit. Proper funding, command-wide support, full implementation. He's not looking to recruit you. He wants to discuss structure, to build this out with you, not just pass the buck. Her gaze fixed on the ceiling tiles. She imagined 4,000 operators absorbing a new set of TTPs like scripture. Kowalski's math echoed in her head, the sheer weight of that many warfighters rewriting their instincts. She balanced the security of the shadows against the impact of the institution, questioning if the scope altered the purpose. Arrange the meeting, she commanded. Harwick nodded. A moment passed. My report is filed. It's locked in. What you did is now on the books. End of story. She stared right through him. Good. Briggs showed up the morning she got the green light to move. In the hum of pre-dawn activity, he looked like a man running on pure will, having outrun his own hesitation. He took a seat. He stared at his hands. When you went down, he began. She said nothing. I made a snap judgment on faulty intel. Less than 30 seconds. And I was 100% wrong. He finally met her eyes. You called it. I was protecting my guys. But I let a hunch harden into truth inside my own head. That ain't tactics. That's a personal weakness, one that's burned me in the past. I knew better. The quiet was crushing. I apologize. She met his stare and held it. Done, she replied, her voice flat. He gave a sharp nod. Get me a slot. First cycle. A line appeared on her forehead. Cycle? Caldwell's new course. The initial group. His stare was piercing. I'm 41. A dozen years in, and I always treated medicine and combat as separate things. That means my whole approach was wrong for 12 years. I need to be in that class. She held his gaze for a beat. You're in, she confirmed. He turned to go. One last comment. Your old man, he said, despite his flaws, he raised you well. And then he was gone. 6 months on, the weariness had finally lifted from her features. The 9 pounds she'd lost after the fight and the hospital stay had returned, her system finally coming off a war footing. On cold mornings, her left shoulder still sent a sharp protest. A deep, nagging ache the doc warned might be permanent. She classified it as an equipment failure, not a personal deficit. Her mornings began at 05:30 with a 6-mile circuit, the Pacific to her left. The glow of Coronado shone in the cool air below. She never changed her route. Her father had hammered into her that routine is not a prison. It's the structure that stands when everything else shatters. Following her run and mess hall, she headed to the Integrated Combat Medicine facility. The second iteration had just begun, 2 weeks after the first graduated. The initial course held 16 students. This one held 22. 47 were on deck for the third. From the doorway, she assessed them. 22 operators, aged 22 to 44, with a collective eternity in the dirt. Orders got them here, but the word on the street filled the seats. The scuttlebutt was, this program gives you a tool you don't even know you have until it's the only one left. Reed Kowalski was seated near the back. He'd put in his request the moment he was cleared for duty, aiming for this very rotation. He hadn't pulled rank, earning his spot on merit like the other 21. His eyes tracked her as she entered. A curt nod passed between them. Third row, Colt Briggs was at attention, posture rigid, his focus total. He was here to learn, not to judge. He had the look of a man whose world had crumbled and was now carefully putting it back together, piece by piece. On the whiteboard behind her were 11 words. She'd written them before the first class began, alone with her thoughts of her father, the valley, and the legacy she was building. They weren't stenciled or printed, just her script in permanent marker, a creed that was never wiped away. It wasn't in the official POI. It was the program's soul. Heal when possible, fight when required, know the difference. Her gaze swept the room. 22 men from various commands, each with his own ghosts. Their common link. They'd all faced that junction and were here to hone the instinct for it. One Tuesday in November, she rang her mother, the sea breeze drifting through her window. For 6 months, The surf was her only companion. Her mother, at 63, still occupied the family home, tending the garden her father had managed with a gunny's precision. After his passing, her mother took over the garden, describing it as the strangest part of her grieving process. It was her way of keeping him close, of seeing his last mission through. They talked for 40 minutes. She reported her shoulder was mission capable. It was. Her mother inquired about the course. Tessa gave her the rundown on the second group. Diverse operators, a shared purpose, and the deep reward of teaching skills that would keep men alive. A silence settled between them. Her mother finally spoke. I was terrified when I got that call. Just absolute fear, then rage, and back again. I know. I just kept imagining what your father would have said. And that you understood the objective. That you were exactly where you needed to be. He's the one who taught me how to read the ground, she replied. He certainly did, her mother agreed. He told me. Her mother's tone grew lighter, as if a weight was gone. He always saw the entire battle space, Tessa. This was on his map. You're damn right it was. Are you at peace with it now? Tessa stared out at the dark, endless ocean. I am, she said. Been that way a while. We just had to say it out loud. Good, her mom replied. That's what matters. Later, she pulled out the letter. It had lived in her jacket pocket for 5 years and 3 months. She sat at her desk, the sealed envelope in her hand. Opening it was pointless. She knew the words by heart. It was now part of her internal SOP, lesson instruction, and more the framework of her core beliefs. She felt the paper's weight. His lesson echoed the gap between an order and the intent behind it, where an operator must rely on their own internal compass. Trust your gut when the op goes sideways. She had. She had made the right call. She opened a drawer, set the letter in the dead center, and closed it. Not concealed, not archived, just stored. She no longer needed to carry it. The order had become an instinct. For 5 years, she had rehearsed its principle until it was second nature. Monday morning, 0800. The room filled with Pacific light as she faced the men, the base a distant hum. 22 operators were on their feet. 11 words were etched on the board. Her mission, her creed, the latest intel brief. The third class had double the applicants. 2 other commands were looking to replicate the training. The Syria AAR was in the system. While classified, the ops details were now a matter of record. She converted that raw information into tactical wisdom. Her eyes found Kowalski in the back, his notebook open. He had the hard stare of a man who knew these lessons were bought with blood. Her gaze moved to Briggs in the third row, his bearing perfect a symbol of how discipline can rebuild a man. She thought of her father, of his 0530, 6-mile runs in San Diego. He knew that the missions that define you are never logged, never decorated, and never mentioned again. A real legacy is the capability you instill in others, the instinct that endures when you're gone. It isn't about the rounds you expend, but the knowledge you impart. A flash of memory, the valley, a black peak, the envelope, the 2-second choice to disregard a direct order for a higher purpose. The count was seared into her brain. 63 lost to save 477. She bore the cold arithmetic of command. Her mother's words echoed. She pictured the letter, now at rest, after 5 years of standing watch over her conscience. She knew the walk through hell. She saw them 22 men who had made that same trek and were here to learn the way back. She drew a long, centering breath. All right, gentlemen, she started, her voice firm and resonant. Let's get to work. And the instruction commenced.